Ronald looked me straight in the eyes, his voice as cold as a Cleveland winter. I want the house, the cars, the restaurant, everything. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize, not a flicker of hesitation. The way he spoke was exactly like he was rereading a script his lawyer had prepared. Smooth, emotionless, not stumbling over a single word, as if 16 years of marriage, 2 children, and everything we had built together were nothing more than a few lines on an asset inventory list. My lawyer, Denise Parker, reached across the conference table and squeezed my hand tight. She had practiced family law in Cleveland for 28 years. She had seen women crushed in courtrooms. She had watched husbands hide assets, twist the truth, and manipulate the system until their wives had nothing left to stand on. But when I leaned toward her and whispered what I was about to do, Denise's eyes widened. Not in surprise, but in genuine worry. The law office sat on Euclid Avenue, on the 12th floor of a gray building left behind from Cleveland's more prosperous days. Through the large window, I could see Lake Erie in the distance, lead-colored water stretching beneath a bleak February sky. This city had taught me how to endure the cold a long time ago, not just the weather, the coldness of people. Denise lowered her voice, urgent. "Valerie, we can fight. And we should fight. He doesn't have the right to demand half of what he's asking for. Ohio is an equitable distribution state. We have options." I looked at her, then slowly shifted my gaze to Ronald. He sat across from me, back straight, shoulders open, the posture of a man who believed victory was already in his hands. Beside him was his lawyer, Leonard Hughes, a white man with silver hair, wearing a perfectly tailored Armani suit, his wrist glittering with a Patek Philippe that made no effort to hide its wealth. On Ronald's face was the faintest smile, almost invisible, the kind of expression that appears when someone believes they've won without having to try. That face. I had stroked it on Sunday mornings. I had pressed it to my chest when his father died. The man who had stood before both our families in a Baptist church, laid his hand on the Bible, and promised he would love me through every rise and fall of life. "Give it to him, miss," I said softly. Denise's pen stopped midair. "What did you just say?" "You heard me." I didn't raise my voice. "The house, the cars, the business. Give him everything he's asking for." Ronald's face twitched for exactly 1 second. A moment so brief, but I saw it. He hadn't expected this surrender. Attorney Hughes leaned toward him, whispering a few words. Ronald nodded slowly, like a man who had just hit the jackpot. He thought I had collapsed. He thought I had raised the white flag, and everyone in that room thought so too. They looked at me, Valerie Thompson, the woman who once held everything, now handing it all to the betrayer. They saw weakness. Letting go, a woman knocked down by a marriage falling apart, but they didn't know what I knew. Denise looked at me for a long time. Her lips parted as if she wanted to object, but 3 decades of experience had taught her how to read a client. She saw in my eyes not tears, not despair, but a cold determination coming from somewhere deep inside. Ronald tried to keep his face neutral, but I could see the flicker of triumph in his eyes. His hand rested on the table, fingers tapping a light rhythm, the music of a man who thinks he's won. He had already started counting money in his head. He had already imagined changing the restaurant's name. Planned renovations, envisioned a new life with a younger, prettier woman, one who didn't carry the baggage of 16 years of marriage. I folded my hands in my lap and sat up straight. In my mind, my grandmother Ruth's voice rang out, clear and steady. "My girl, the one who knows how to be silent is the one who holds power. The one who rushes to brag will expose their own weakness." And Ronald, my husband, was making the biggest mistake of his life. He thought my silence was weakness. Outside the window, snow began to fall. White flakes slanted in the wind, covering Cleveland in a mournful gray. And in that conference room, a trap was slowly being completed, a trap Ronald would walk into on his own 2 feet. That night, I returned to the temporary apartment I'd rented in University Circle, a small place I'd moved into after leaving the house I shared with Ronald. 1 bedroom, a cramped kitchen, simple furniture, but at least it was mine. I had just taken off my shoes, hadn't even changed clothes yet, when my phone rang. Ruth Thompson's name appeared on the screen. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and only then picked up. Grandma Ruth wasn't the type to call for fun. When she called, it was always because something mattered, and from the very first sound, I heard it in her voice, worry mixed with anger. "Valerie Thompson," she said, using my full name, never a good sign. "What are you doing?" I sat down on the worn-out sofa, the one item I'd brought over from the restaurant. The electric heater clicked, fighting the February cold. "Grandma, I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" Her voice shook. Not from weakness, but from emotion held tightly in place. "Your grandfather built Thompson Home Kitchen with his bare hands. He started with a food cart outside Case Western Reserve, worked himself to exhaustion just so your mother and your uncles could have something real. And now you're about to hand it to a man who doesn't deserve even 1 second of your loyalty." Every word cut into my heart. Not because she was wrong, because she was exactly right. Thompson Home Kitchen wasn't just a restaurant. It was a legacy. My grandfather's sweat and tears. The place I grew up, learned to cook, learned business, learned how to love a community. "Grandma, I haven't lost my mind, I promise." "Haven't lost your mind?" She let out a long breath. "A broken heart makes people make bad decisions. Let me call your Uncle Frederick. Let me gather the family." "No, Grandma." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not broken. Not anymore. And I know exactly what I'm doing." On the other end, there was silence. I could hear her breathing, steady, deliberate. She had raised 4 children alone after my grandfather died. Worked in a school kitchen for 32 years, seen everything life could throw at a black woman, and still stood firm. Finally, she spoke again, softer. "Your grandfather used to say patience is a weapon when it's in the right hands. I'm praying you know what you're holding." "I do, Grandma, I promise." "All right." She paused. "I won't ask again, but remember, whatever happens, this family is here. Don't ever think you have to carry it alone." After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of the apartment. Streetlight spilled through the window, painting long streaks across the old wooden floor. I thought about my grandfather, the man who taught me that success isn't in noise, but in quiet endurance. He died of a stroke when I was 27. That day was an autumn afternoon. He was in the kitchen preparing for Thanksgiving. He went down, still holding a wooden ladle. I ran in and found him there, his eyes looking at me like he wanted to apologize, as if he felt guilty for leaving me behind. "Grandpa, don't leave me," I cried. He couldn't speak anymore. He only gripped my hand, tight one last time, then let go. That was the first time I understood what real loss was, and now, 16 years later, I felt it again, not losing a person, but losing trust. The next morning, Marcia showed up at my door with 2 coffees from Phoenix Coffee, the place we used to go back when we were young. Her eyes were full of worry. Marcia Collins had been my best friend since college at Cleveland State. We had been young, dreamed big, believed that if we worked hard enough, we could build something that mattered. "Tell me," Marcia said as she stepped inside and shut the door to keep the warmth in. "Tell me you didn't really agree to give him everything. Tell me Denise misunderstood." "I gave him everything." Marcia set the coffee down so hard some of it splashed. "Have you lost your mind? The restaurant your grandfather built? The house you renovated with your own money? The investments you made while he was out there doing God knows what?" "Yes." "Why?" I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick file. Bank statements, bills, credit cards, phone logs, investigation reports. I slid it toward her. "Because he doesn't know what he's really taking." Marcia opened the file, read the first page, the second. The third, by the sixth page, her hand was covering her mouth, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and wicked satisfaction. Is this? Her voice trembled. Everything. And he has no idea I know. Marcia closed the file carefully, as if it were both precious and dangerous. Valerie, she said slowly, you might be the coldest woman I've ever met, and I mean that with absolute respect. I looked out the window. Snow was still falling. Cleveland in winter, black and white, unforgiving, nothing but pure survival. People think I lost. They think I quit. My mother's crying. My cousins are worried. The church is whispering prayers for my broken spirit. I turned back to Marcia. But they don't know what I know. They don't see what I dug up from 3 years of financial records, secret emails, and digital traces he thought he erased. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight louder. It's to step back, stay quiet, and let your enemy walk into the trap they built with their own hands. So what's next? Marcia asked. Wait, I said, let him think he's won. And when he signs the final papers, then the trap closes. That night, alone in the apartment, I opened an old photo box, the first photo, my grandfather beside his food cart, 1987, outside the gates of Case Western Reserve. He was grinning wide, holding a fried chicken plate. Back then, I only had $200 and a dream, he used to say. I wasn't selling food. I was selling the feeling of home. The second photo, the first restaurant in Glenville, 1992, 8 tables, always full. The third photo, him and me in the kitchen when I was 16. Cooking is about heart, he said. If you're patient, the food will come out complete, I cried. Not from weakness, from resolve. 2 days later, I met Leonard Hughes, the private investigator, not Ronald's lawyer, but someone entirely different. A retired Cleveland police officer who'd left after 24 years, specializing in financial crimes. His office was on Ontario Street, downtown Cleveland, old, cramped, smelling of coffee and paper. Mrs. Thompson, he said bluntly, the people who hire me usually already know the truth. They just need confirmation. Are you ready? I need proof. He nodded. From the beginning. And I told him. 90 minutes, everything. I'll track it, review the finances, phones, emails, every trace, he said. It'll take 2 to 3 weeks. Can you keep acting normal? I've been pretending for 2 years. His gaze softened. Then you understand the cost of silence. I signed the contract, wrote the check, and walked out. At least, I wasn't standing still anymore. The door had closed. But that was only the surface of the story. In the next part, Valerie's silence will start answering, through evidence, through truths Ronald never even imagined. The next 3 weeks were the longest 3 weeks of my life. Every morning I woke up in my small apartment, but 3 times a week I still had to drive to the old house, the one Ronald was living in, to pick up the kids. Under the court's temporary order, Ronald and I alternated custody, which meant I had to see his face, had to talk to him, had to stand in the same space as him, and most importantly, I had to pretend I didn't know what was happening. On the first morning of the investigation week, I arrived at 7 to pick up Jasmine and Marcus, our 12-year-old daughter and 8-year-old son, for school. Ronald opened the door. He was in pajamas, hair messy, and there was the faint scent of expensive men's cologne on him, a new scent, not the one he used to wear. "Hi," he said, in a voice so normal it was terrifying, as if we were just 2 acquaintances trading schedules. As if he wasn't the man who had destroyed 16 years of my marriage. "Hi." I kept my tone neutral. "Are the kids ready?" Jasmine is eating breakfast. Marcus is still getting dressed. He opened the door wider. "Do you want to come in for coffee?" I wanted to refuse. To turn around, to run out of there immediately. But Leonard had been crystal clear. Act normal. Don't let him suspect anything. "Okay." Thanks. I stepped into the house I once called home, and a wave of memories hit me like a slap. The kitchen I renovated with my own money. The living room where we used to watch movies on Friday nights. The staircase the kids had run up and down 1,000 times. Everything looked the same, and yet it was completely different. Like the skeleton of a dead marriage. Ronald poured me coffee. He still remembered. 2 spoons of sugar, a little milk. That small detail hurt more than anything. How could he remember how I drank my coffee and forget how to love me? So, he leaned against the counter, casual. How's the divorce going? The question was as light as asking about the weather. I tightened my grip on the mug, feeling the heat through the ceramic. It's moving forward. Denise is finalizing the paperwork. Good. Ronald took a sip. Leonard says everything will be quick. No need to drag it out. He looked at me like he was trying to perform a little kindness. I know this isn't easy for you, Val, but maybe this is what's best for both of us. We've lost each other. Lost each other. That phrase made me want to throw the coffee in his face. We didn't lose each other. He chose to leave, chose to betray, chose to steal, but I swallowed it all down and simply nodded. Maybe. Just then, Jasmine walked into the kitchen. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. Mom! She ran to hug me, and in that moment, everything else dissolved. My daughter, 12 years old, tall and beautiful, her natural curls that I had carefully braided yesterday. Hi, sweetheart. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the coconut oil scent I always smoothed into her hair. Are you ready for school? I'm ready. Jasmine hesitated, then looked straight at me with serious eyes. Eyes just like Grandma Ruth's. But Mom, are you and Dad okay? Dad looked sad. Ronald, sad? I glanced at him. He stood there with his coffee, his face arranged into the perfect worried expression. He was acting. Acting for my daughter, and Jasmine, with the pure heart of a child, was believing it. You don't need to worry, sweetie. I softened my voice as much as I could. This is grown-up stuff. Your dad and I are handling it. Right then, Marcus came racing down the stairs, backpack thumping his back, shoes still untied. Mom, can you make pancakes after school? You promised last week. Of course you'll get pancakes. I knelt down to tie his shoes. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear. From rage. My son was asking for pancakes while his parents' marriage was collapsing right above his head. And he had no idea. Not yet. When I walked the kids out to the car, Ronald followed. He hugged Jasmine and Marcus, kissed the tops of their heads. I love you. Study hard, okay? Then he looked at me. Val, if you need anything, just call. No matter what happens between us, we're still the parents of these two. I nodded because I didn't trust myself to open my mouth without breaking apart. I drove away, the kids chattering in the back seat about tests, friends, tiny childhood things. And me. I gripped the steering wheel, grinding my teeth so I wouldn't cry. On the 3rd night of the investigation week, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark of my apartment staring at the ceiling, and it felt like my thoughts were clawing at me from the inside. I grabbed my journal, the one I started when everything began to get bad, and I wrote like it was the only way not to go insane. February 23rd, 2:30 a.m. I don't know how much longer I can hold this together. 3 days, just 3 days, but it feels like 3 years. Today I had to watch Ronald smile at the kids, had to hear him say, I love you. And I wanted to scream, if you love them, why are you destroying this family? Why are you stealing their legacy? But I can't. Not yet. Leonard called today. He said the investigation is moving in the right direction. He didn't say more, but his voice, I could hear it. He found something. Something terrible. I'm scared. Not of the truth. I've known, or at least felt it, for a long time. I'm scared of my own reaction when I see proof, when there's no room left for denial. Marcia asked if I'm okay. I said I am. A lie. I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a long time. But I'm not allowed to fall apart. Not yet. Not now. The kids need me steady. The restaurant needs me steady. Grandpa needs me to protect his legacy. Tonight I dreamed of him. He stood in the Thompson home kitchen, holding the wooden ladle, smiling at me. He said, "My girl, patience is the strongest weapon. Don't rush. Sauce needs time before it soaks in." I woke up with tears on my cheeks. I miss him. I miss him so much I feel crazy. And I swear to him, to myself, to the 2 children sleeping in the next room, I will protect what he built, no matter what it costs. I closed the journal and put it back in the drawer. Outside, Cleveland was silent beneath the snow. The city slept, and I was awake, always awake. There's something people never say about waiting for proof. You don't wait in peace. You wait in hell. You still have to be a mother, still go to work, still cook, drive, answer texts, smile at your kids, nod at neighbors, while inside you, an alarm is screaming nonstop. And the scariest part? It's not when you find out someone betrayed you. It's when you start asking yourself, what if the truth is worse than I imagined? And will I still be able to stand? The second week was even harder. Jasmine started asking more questions. 12 years old, sensitive and smart, she had noticed something was wrong. Thursday night, as we folded laundry, Jasmine asked, "Mom, why don't you live at home with Dad anymore?" My hands froze on a shirt. My chest tightened. "Sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups need space. It doesn't mean we don't love each other. But Dad doesn't look very sad." Jasmine looked at me with eyes too old for her age. "Dad looks happy, like he's relieved." A 12-year-old had seen what I was trying to hide. Her dad wasn't suffering. He was relieved. He was free. I took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Jasmine, do you know I love you and Marcus more than anything in the world?" "I know." "And do you know that no matter what happens between me and your dad, that never changes?" Jasmine nodded, but I saw tears shimmering in her eyes. And in that moment, I hated Ronald more than ever, not because he betrayed me, but because he was making my daughter worry about things that didn't belong in childhood. That night, my phone rang at 1:15 a.m. Ronald's name lit up the screen. My heart pounded. He had never called that late, unless... "Hello? Val?" His voice sounded wrong, like he was drunk or had been crying. "I need to talk to you." "Ronald, it's 1 a.m. "What is it? Are the kids okay?" "The kids are fine. They're asleep." There was a pause. Then he asked, his voice rougher, "Do you regret it? Us?" The question made me sit up in bed. "What are you talking about?" I was thinking about the early days, when everything was good, when we still loved each other." He exhaled. "How did it end up like this, Val?" Anger flared up like fire. "How did it end up like this?" I repeated, voice cold. "Are you seriously asking me that? Do you want an answer to that?" I'm just saying, don't ever call me at this hour again, Ronald." I cut him off. "Especially when you're drunk. Especially when you're trying to justify what you did. We're done." "You wanted that. Now don't call in the middle of the night looking for forgiveness." I hung up. My hands were shaking. My whole body was shaking. I wanted to smash something. Wanted to scream loud enough for the whole city to hear. But instead, I sat in the dark, hugged my knees, and let the tears run in silence. On the 19th day of the investigation, Leonard called. "Mrs. Thompson, I have the full report. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock? I swallowed hard. "How bad is it?" There was a pause. In that silence, I heard everything I needed to know. "I think it's best we discuss it in person, Mrs. Thompson." I arrived at Leonard's office at 8:45, 15 minutes early. I hadn't slept last night. I hadn't eaten breakfast. I'd only had black coffee and waited for the sun to rise the way people wait for a sentence. Leonard met me at the door and led me into a small conference room. This time, the table wasn't holding just a few files. It was covered in manila folders, each clearly labeled, carefully organized, financial, phone. Surveillance, email, hotels, travel. I sat down. My legs almost couldn't hold my body's weight. "Mrs. Thompson," Leonard began, professional, but I could hear a layer of anger held underneath, the anger of a man who'd watched too many men destroy their own families. "I'll be direct because you deserve the unvarnished truth. Your husband has been having an affair for about 26 months. 2 years and 2 months. 2 years and 2 months. That number drove straight into my chest like a knife. Not a few months, not a single mistake. 2 years and 2 months of calculated deception. 2 years and 2 months of coming home to me and the kids after being with another woman." Leonard slid a stack of photos toward me. "I took these over the last 3 weeks, but I also gathered digital evidence going back nearly 2 years. I opened the photos. The first, Ronald and a young woman walking into the Intercontinental downtown. Timestamp 2:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, the day he told me he had a meeting that would run until 6. The second, they were at Marble Room Steaks and Raw Bar. Candlelit, tucked in a corner. Her hand was on his thigh under the table. Ronald was smiling, the smile I remembered from the beginning, when he used to look at me like I was everything. The third, they were shopping at Legacy Village in Lyndhurst, holding hands like teenagers. Ronald looked at jewelry the way he'd never looked at jewelry with me. The fourth, they were kissing in a parking lot. Not a polite kiss, the kind of kiss people share when they're in love. His hand buried in her hair, their bodies pressed together with the familiarity of people who have done this 1,000 times. Every photo was a wound. Every photo was a lie peeled open. I forced myself to look at all of them, the way you force yourself to stare at an injury just to know how deep it goes. "Her name is Tiffany Moore." Leonard opened another folder. 28. Graduated from Kent State 5 years ago. Works in pharmaceutical sales for the same company as your husband. They met at a regional conference in Detroit 26 months ago. Leonard turned pages, his voice steady like a scalpel. They saw each other about 4 times a week. Sometimes it was a 3-hour lunch. Sometimes an overnight hotel stay when he told you he was working late. They took 4 trips in the last year. He pulled out printed itineraries, hotel receipts, airline tickets. Miami in January. The trip, he said, was a sales conference. New Orleans in May, when he said he was visiting a potential client. Savannah in September, on your daughter's birthday weekend, when he claimed he had an emergency meeting he couldn't move. And Las Vegas in November. Savannah. Jasmine's birthday weekend. I remembered that day so clearly. My daughter crying because her dad wasn't at her party. I had defended him, told her dad was working hard for the family, promised he would make it up to her, while he was out there making memories with someone else, in a life where me and the kids didn't exist. They have a regular hotel downtown, Leonard continued. Intercontinental, usually executive floor rooms. He paid in cash to avoid a paper trail, but I confirmed it through other means. He flipped again. High-end dinners, Marble Room, Lola, Red the Steakhouse, always downtown or in Ohio City, areas where he was less likely to run into your social circle. Leonard paused and studied me. "Mrs. Thompson, would you like some water?" I shook my head. My throat was dry, but I couldn't drink. I couldn't move. I could only listen as my life was torn apart and presented in a calm, professional voice. "There's one more detail," Leonard said, slower. "Ms. Moore doesn't know he's married and has children. That hit me harder than the rest. She didn't know. She was being lied to, too, just in a different way. But more importantly," Leonard pulled out a folder thicker than all the others, stuffed with bank statements, spreadsheets, documents highlighted in yellow and covered in sticky notes. "During the investigation, I found something else, beyond an affair." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of my chair. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "your husband has been embezzling money from Thompson Home Kitchen for about 22 months, nearly 2 years." The world stopped. What? He used his access to the business accounts, access you granted when you added him as an authorized signer 4 years ago, to move money into an offshore account. At first it was small, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, buried inside expenses that looked legitimate. But it escalated. In just the last 8 months, he transferred over $287,000. I couldn't breathe. My fingers clamped the table edge until it hurt. The restaurant. My grandfather's legacy. Ronald had been bleeding it right under my nose. Leonard spread out statements, pointed at the flagged transfers, followed the money with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life hunting financial criminals. He showed me the shell companies under Ronald's name, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and an entire deception network running steadily like a machine. "There's more," Leonard said, his voice turning heavier, "and this is the part that becomes legally dangerous for you." I looked at him. "He used your business credit to fund the affair. Hotel rooms, jewelry, trips, expensive dinners. He ran it through accounts under your name, the company American Express card that Thompson Home Kitchen pays off every month. Total non-business charges, $63,000. I heard my blood pounding in my ears. "If this comes out during the divorce process," Leonard continued, "you could be forced to carry financial liability. The IRS could view it as personal use of business funds, meaning tax fraud. You could be implicated even if you had no idea." The walls closed in. This wasn't just betrayal. This was financial destruction, legal risk, potentially even criminal exposure. Ronald didn't just stop loving me. He was actively destroying me, destroying my grandfather's legacy to feed his new life. I heard my own voice, distant like it came from somewhere else. "Can you prove I didn't know? Can you prove I wasn't involved?" "That's why I documented everything so thoroughly." Leonard closed the folders. "Timestamps show you were at the restaurant during many of these transactions. You have witnesses to your schedule and work habits. Your personal financial records show you live modestly and didn't benefit from the stolen money. I can prove you weren't involved." He looked straight at me. "But from this point forward, you have to move extremely carefully." Leonard closed the last folder, his tone dropping, and there was something in it that almost sounded like respect. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been doing this a long time. I've seen people break from far less than what you're facing. But I can tell you, you're not the kind of woman who breaks easily." Then he said slowly, each word like a nail being driven in, "This is my professional advice. Get a lawyer, get a good one. Document everything. And whatever you do, don't let him know what you know. Not yet. Surprise is the only advantage you have." I left Leonard's office with copies of everything. Photos, statements, proof of 2 years of deception and systematic theft. I sat in my car in the parking lot and allowed myself to fall apart for exactly 10 minutes. I cried for the marriage I thought I had. I cried for the man I thought I married. I cried for my children, who would have to live with the consequences of their father's choices. I cried because Grandma Ruth's legacy had been violated. I cried for myself, the version of me naive enough to believe love and loyalty were enough. Then I wiped my tears, touched up my makeup, and I called Denise Parker. "I need to see you right now," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "I have everything we need to destroy him." Denise Parker's office was on the 15th floor of the tower at Erie View, facing straight out toward Lake Erie, gray as lead. The room was spacious, quiet, and carried the solemn authority of places people come to end an old life. Dark wood furniture, shelves packed tight with law books, and a wall covered in degrees and certificates. The footprints of 28 years of Denise walking into Cleveland family courtrooms without her hands ever trembling. Denise was a black woman in her 50s. Her hair was short, salt and pepper, cut neat as if she allowed nothing unnecessary to exist, emotions included. Her eyes were sharp and awake, the kind of gaze that had grown used to staring straight at the truth, no matter how ugly it was. When I stepped in, Denise was standing with her back to the door, looking out the window, coffee cup in hand. Her spine was straight as a blade. "Valerie," she turned. Just one word, and I heard both worry and readiness for battle inside it. She studied me like someone who had learned to read pain through silence. "Sit down. Tell me." I sat, set the file bag on her desk, and for 2 hours I told her everything. I told her what Leonard Hughes had found, the affair that lasted 26 months. 4 romantic trips while I stayed home with the kids, $287,000 embezzled from Thompson Home Kitchen, $63,000 in personal spending on the business credit card. I told her about Tiffany Moore, 28, the woman who didn't even know Ronald had a family. Every detail, every lie, every betrayal was inside photographs, bank statements, and hotel receipts. Denise didn't interrupt. She only nodded sometimes, occasionally jotting a few lines on a yellow legal pad. The way she listened was the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, quiet, precise, and missing nothing. When I finished, Denise set her pen down. She looked at me straight on for a long time. "Valerie," she said slowly, "you have enough to destroy him. We can take this into court, put everything on the record, expose every single piece. I can make sure Ronald walks away with nothing. I can make this man pay for what he's done." I took a deep breath, not because I was afraid, but because I knew I was about to say something that would stop Denise cold. "I don't want that." Denise lifted her head immediately, as if she'd misheard. "Excuse me? I want to give him everything he's demanding." For 1 second, Denise's face, hardened through thousands of divorces, usually giving away nothing, showed a rare flicker of surprise. "Have you lost your mind?" I didn't look away. "I need you to trust me, Denise. I need him to think he's won." I placed both hands on the desk, my voice calm to the point of ice. "And I need you to help me build a trap he'll never see coming." Denise didn't answer right away. She just stared at me, like she was weighing the line between strategy and recklessness. I could see an entire machine working behind her eyes, a seasoned attorney calculating risk, rerunning scenarios, revisiting every variable. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "Then tell me your plan." I opened the file Leonard had given me and spread the documents across Denise's polished wooden desk. "Under Ohio law," I said, pointing to a marked section, "once Ronald becomes the sole owner of Thompson Home Kitchen, he becomes fully responsible for any criminal activity carried out under that business's name." Denise bent closer to read, her eyes sharpening. "Right now," I continued, "he's only an authorized signer, but when he owns 100%, when his name is on every document, when he's the only owner, then he becomes the primary offender, instead of an accomplice," Denise finished. She looked up, and for the first time that day, something cold flashed in her eyes, the look of a woman who had just seen the path. Then Denise tightened her jaw. "Valerie, this is a dangerous strategy. If he gets suspicious and backs out, you lose everything." "He won't back out," I said, and I surprised myself with the certainty in my own voice. "I know Ronald. Greed will blind him." I paused, then kept going, each word dropping like stone. "He always thinks he's the smartest person in the room. Always. He will never imagine that I, the quiet wife, always accommodating, could set a trap for him." Denise stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind her back. Below, Cleveland stretched out, an old industrial city with scars and recoveries where people learn to survive long winters through endurance. Silence held. Then Denise turned. "All right, Her voice was final. "But we need one more person." I looked at her. "A forensic accountant," Denise said. "Someone who can build a case that can't be broken. Do you have someone in mind?" "Elijah Carter." Denise answered instantly, as if the name had been sitting in her brain's contact list. "Best black forensic guy in financial crimes. He's worked with the FBI, the IRS, handled some of the biggest embezzlement cases in Ohio. If anyone can turn Ronald's money trail into an indictment, it's Elijah." Denise returned to the desk, opened her laptop, typed fast. Then she looked up, her expression hardening. "But Valerie, you need to understand one thing. Once you start down this road, there's no turning back." Denise spoke slowly, each sentence landing like a hammer. "You'll have to sign papers handing him the house you renovated with your own money. Hand over the restaurant your grandfather built. You'll have to sit there while your family thinks you quit. You'll have to take it all in silence until the trap closes." I didn't blink. "I've endured 2 years already," I said softly but steady. "I can endure a few more weeks. Some people think revenge is shouting, pounding tables, throwing everything into the open for the whole world to see. They don't understand. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the scream, it's deliberate silence. Silence when someone insults you. Silence when someone steals from you. Silence when the whole world thinks you've lost. Because inside that silence, you're doing something your enemy never expects. You're letting them take one more step, deeper into their own trap." 2 days later, I met Elijah Carter at a small cafe in Little Italy. Quiet, private, discreet enough that we were unlikely to be seen. Elijah was a tall, slim black man in his late 30s. He wore gold-rimmed glasses and carried an old leather bag stuffed with documents. The kind of bag you could tell had been dragged through countless work sessions and conference rooms. "Mrs. Thompson." He shook my hand. His grip was warm and steady, not overly familiar, but enough to make you feel you weren't alone. "Denise told me about your situation. I'm very sorry for what you're going through." We sat in the farthest corner. The light was dim, soft jazz playing through the speakers, the kind of space made for conversations people don't want anyone to overhear. Elijah pulled out his laptop, opened spreadsheets. And over the next 90 minutes, he explained exactly how Ronald had been moving my money. "This is sophisticated," Elijah said, his index finger tracing along rows of numbers. "He didn't take one big chunk and disappear. He learned from other embezzlement cases." Elijah pointed line by line. 3,000 here, labeled consulting. 5,000 there, labeled marketing expenses. 8,000 for equipment upgrades, but there weren't any upgrades. He looked up at me. Over 22 months, those small withdrawals added up to nearly 300,000. My voice came out smaller, like a question I was afraid to ask. How did I not see it? "Because you trusted him," Elijah answered simply. No blame, no judgment, just the bare truth. "And that's what embezzlers rely on. Trust." Elijah paused. "They know family won't check every payment, every receipt. They turn love into a weapon." He closed the laptop, set both hands on the table. "But this is what's beautiful about your plan. Once he owns Thompson Home Kitchen outright, he can't blame anyone else. Every signature, every transaction, every hidden account points straight back to him." So, Elijah continued, his voice even but heavy as stone. "I can build a case any prosecutor would want. Wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. If he's convicted, we're talking 15 to 20 years in federal prison." I didn't flinch. Not because I was heartless, but because in that moment I understood. Ronald hadn't just betrayed me. He had signed his own sentence. He just didn't know it yet. "How long do you need?" I asked. "Give me 3 weeks," Elijah said. "I'll prepare everything, every transaction, every money trail, every connection, a file that can't be denied." The hardest part wasn't the legal strategy. The hardest part was telling my family, especially Grandma Ruth. I went to her house on a weekend evening, the old home in Glenville where I grew up, where my grandfather died, where all my childhood memories were stored. She was in the kitchen making mac and cheese, my grandfather's recipe, when I walked in. My girl. She hugged me tight. She smelled like buttermilk, cheese, and home. You look thinner. Are you eating? Grandma, I swallowed hard. I need to talk to you about my plan. We sat at the old kitchen table, the table where I did homework, where Grandpa taught me card games, where the family gathered over countless meals, and I told her about the affair, about the embezzlement, about my plan to hand Ronald everything so I could trap him. Ruth listened in silence. Her face showed nothing, like a lake when the wind stops. When I finished, she didn't answer right away. She stayed quiet for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the cabinet, and took out a small box. Your grandfather left this for you, she said, opening it. Inside was a simple ring, my grandfather's plain gold wedding band. Before he died, she said, her voice low as a stove flame, he told me, if Valerie ever faces hard times, give her this. Remind her that a Thompson never quits. We fight smart, not loud. She placed the ring in my hand. You're doing the right thing, Valerie. And this time, her eyes softened just a little. Patience is a weapon, and you're holding it like a warrior. Your grandfather would be proud. I closed my fist around the ring, the cool weight of gold against my skin like an oath. We held each other right there in that kitchen, and I felt it. The strength of 3 generations of Thompson women moving through me. My grandmother, who raised 4 children alone. My mother, who taught school for 30 years, and now me, protecting the legacy my grandfather left behind, no matter what it cost. I woke up at 5 a.m, on the very day of the final hearing. Outside the window, Cleveland was still swallowed by darkness. Snow fell quietly, thin white flakes drifting sideways in the cold March wind. This city always had its own way of reminding you that winter never lets go easily. Just like shattered lives, they don't end with an explosion. They end with a long, drawn-out silence, slowly cutting into flesh. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ronald's face. I saw the trap about to snap shut. I saw the moment the courtroom doors opened. And I saw everything that was about to happen, like a film reel playing ahead inside my head, giving me no chance to run. I put on a black suit, simple, formal, unshowy. I braided my hair into a neat bun at the nape of my neck. No jewelry, except my grandfather's ring that Ruth had pressed into my hand in Glenville. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman I almost didn't recognize. Eyes heavier and deeper, a face thinner, but something hard in my gaze. Something that hadn't existed 3 months ago. My phone rang. Denise. Are you ready? Her voice was firm, like someone who had stood at the front line too long to allow any uncertainty. I'm ready, as much as I can be. Agents Willis and Chen will arrive at 10:15, exactly 15 minutes after you sign the final papers, Denise said slowly, as if repeating each number to carve it into my bones. Elijah delivered everything to the prosecutor. They have enough to arrest him right there in court. I gripped the phone tighter. My voice trembled slightly, even though I tried to stay calm. Denise, what if something goes wrong? On the other end, Denise answered almost instantly, no hesitation. Nothing goes wrong, she said. We've checked every angle. Now you only have to do one thing. Trust the plan. Denise paused. Then her voice lowered, like she was speaking to the human part of me, not the strategy. And Valerie? Yes? The woman I met 3 months ago couldn't do this, Denise said slowly. But the woman standing here today, she's a warrior. Don't forget that. I ended the call. In the rented room, the electric heater clicked softly. Outside, snow kept falling. I straightened my back, took a deep breath, and walked out the door like someone who had decided, even if the sky fell, I would not step back. The Cuyahoga County Courthouse in downtown Cleveland was an old, cold block of sandstone, where thousands of marriages had died officially. I arrived at 9:30, 30 minutes early. My family was already there. Ruth, my mother, Uncle Frederick, Marcia, and a few others. They sat on hard wooden benches, faces tight, as if waiting for a verdict not only from the court, but from life itself. My mother sprang up when she saw me. She hugged me hard. "My daughter," her voice caught, "I still don't understand why you did it. But I believe you. I've always believed you." Ruth said nothing. She only took my hand, held it 1 second longer than usual, then looked straight into my eyes. In that look was a strange calm, the calm of someone who has lived through enough storms to recognize sometimes silence is the sign of a massive wave about to crash. Marcia stepped close and leaned into my ear. "Are you ready for this?" I didn't look at Marcia. I stared straight at the courtroom doors. "It's time." At exactly 10, we were called in. The courtroom was small, dark wood. Harsh white fluorescent lights made everything feel more exposed, as if the room had been built for one purpose only, to strip the last layer off a person. On the raised bench sat Judge Morrison, a white woman with silver hair around 60. Her eyes were the kind that had seen everything: fake tears, hollow vows, breakups that turned into war. Ronald was already there. He sat beside his attorney, Leonard Hughes, expensive gray suit, navy silk tie. Fresh haircut. Ronald looked like a successful CEO, not a thief and a betrayer. When I walked in, Ronald glanced at me, quickly, then looked away. No guilt, no apology. Only cold indifference. I sat beside Denise. My hands trembled slightly as I placed them in my lap, but I kept my spine straight, the way Denise had trained me from day one. "Don't let them see you fall." "We'll begin," Judge Morrison said, her voice dry and efficient. "Thompson versus Thompson." "I understand the parties have reached an agreement." Leonard Hughes rose, looking so pleased he could barely hide it. "Yes, Your Honor. My client and Mrs. Thompson have agreed on the division of assets. All terms have been accepted." The judge turned her gaze toward us. "Ms. Parker?" Denise stood, calm and professional. "Yes, Your Honor. My client agrees to the terms as presented." Judge Morrison lowered her eyes to the papers. Her brow tightened. Then she looked up at me. "Mrs. Thompson, I have to be frank. This is one of the most unfavorable settlements I've ever seen." She spoke slowly, as if giving me a chance to change my mind. "You are giving up ownership of the home, the assets, and the family business. Are you certain?" I stood. My legs shook slightly, but my voice held. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm certain." "You don't want me to reconsider? You are entitled to more than this." I met her eyes. No flinching, no softness. "I want it to end, Your Honor. I just want to move forward." Judge Morrison stared at me for a long time. Her gaze was surgical, trying to cut through my words to the truth underneath. Finally, she nodded. "Very well. If both parties consent, I will approve the agreement. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, step forward to sign." There's something people don't often say about revenge moments. They don't look like the movies. No dramatic music the instant you stand up. No spotlight hitting your face like a stage. No one rising to clap. There's only a pen. And sometimes your entire life, your family's legacy, the justice you've been waiting for, rests in the moment you lower that pen onto paper. You sign, and the world turns. We walked up to the clerk's table. Ronald stood 3 feet from me, but it felt like 3 miles. I caught the scent of his cologne, expensive, masculine, and completely unfamiliar. Not the scent he wore when we married. This was the scent of a new man. A man who wasn't my husband anymore. The clerk laid the documents down. I looked at the lines. Valerie Thompson relinquishes all ownership rights to the real property located at 2847 Fairmont Boulevard, the house I renovated with my own money, and all shares in Thompson Home Kitchen, my grandfather's legacy. My hand closed around the pen. For 1 second, I saw my grandfather. I saw the kitchen. I saw the wooden ladle. I heard his voice. "Patience, my girl. Anything good takes time." I signed. Valerie Thompson. Clear, steady, not shaking. Ronald signed immediately after. Big signature. Confident. And then he smiled, thin, unable to hide his satisfaction. He believed he had just won. "Finalized," Judge Morrison said. Effective immediately, Mr. Thompson is now the sole owner of all assets listed. Ronald turned to Leonard Hughes, shook his hand, grinning. I saw him whisper something. Hughes nodded, smiling too. They thought it was over. They thought the victory was complete. I looked at my watch. 10:14, 1 minute. 10:15. The courtroom doors opened, not gently but thrown wide with a kind of determination that didn't ask permission. 2 people walked in. FBI Special Agents Andrea Willis and Marcus Chen, both in black suits. Badges catching the fluorescent light, the air in the courtroom froze like ice. Andrea Willis, a black woman with short braids, a face without expression but eyes hard as steel, walked straight to Leonard Hughes' table. Marcus Chen stood behind her, hand near the cuffs at his belt. "Leonard Hughes?" Willis's voice was official. Authoritative. Hughes stood, confused. "Yes? What is this?" Willis held out a large envelope. "This is a federal subpoena for your client." Willis paused, and that pause made the entire room stop breathing. "And an arrest warrant." Time seemed to slow. I watched Hughes open the envelope. His hand shook as his eyes scanned the first page. I watched the color drain from his face within seconds, pink to paper white. Hughes bent down, whispering urgently into Ronald's ear. I couldn't hear a word, but I saw Ronald's body lock. His shoulders tightened. His hand gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Andrea Willis turned toward Ronald, voice loud enough for every person in the room to hear each word clearly. "Ronald Thompson, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Ronald exploded. "No!" He spun toward me, eyes wide with shock and fury. "Valerie!" Judge Morrison slammed her gavel. "Order!" "I will have order in my courtroom." But Ronald didn't hear her. He shot to his feet, lunging toward me. Marcus Chen moved instantly, blocking him, a firm hand to Ronald's chest like a wall. "You set me up! You knew! You planned all of this!" Ronald's voice was no longer the voice of the confident man I once knew. It cracked, turning into the howl of someone cornered, the sound of a man realizing he had stepped into a hell of his own making. I stood, slowly, every movement deliberate. I walked toward him and stopped 3 feet away, the same distance we'd stood when we signed the papers. I looked straight into his eyes. "I knew everything, Ronald," I said, so calm it chilled even me. Every single lie. His eyes twitched hard like he'd been slapped. "I knew about Tiffany. I knew about the trips. I knew about the money you stole from my grandfather's restaurant." I kept speaking, not rushing, not shouting like I was reading a sentence. I knew it all. I tilted my head just slightly. "And I gave you exactly what you wanted, because once it belonged to you, every crime belonged to you." I saw the moment Ronald's brain connected the pieces. The moment he understood my silence wasn't weakness, that my surrender was strategy, that every paper he had just signed had turned him from a hidden criminal into a name printed clearly on a federal file. "You underestimated me," I said, soft as breath. "You thought I was weak. You thought I would accept it. But my grandfather taught me one thing, Ronald. The one who knows how to be patient is the one who wins." Marcus Chen pulled out the handcuffs. "Mr. Thompson, put your hands behind your back." "No." "Valerie, you can't let them do this!" Ronald kept screaming, voice breaking, desperate. "I'm sorry, do you hear me? I'm sorry for everything. Please." Click. The cuffs closed around his wrists. My family sat frozen. My mother sprang up, one hand over her mouth. Ruth stayed seated, her face unreadable. But I saw tears sliding down her cheeks. Not tears of grief, but tears of release. Tears of justice. Andrea Willis and Marcus Chen led Ronald out. He kept looking back at me, still shouting, but his voice blurred and faded as the courtroom doors closed behind him. Silence fell over the room. Then Judge Morrison spoke, her voice rough. "Court is adjourned." I stood there, alone in the dark wood room. I felt the weight of the past 3 months, the past 2 years. Every night I had to pretend, every time I swallowed my tears. And finally, for the first time in a long time, I could breathe deeply. The legal proceedings dragged on for 6 months. 6 months of depositions, hearings, and the presentation of evidence. Endless and surreal, as if I were watching my own life from a distance. I attended every major session, sitting on hard wooden benches in federal court, listening to prosecutors lay out the case Elijah Carter had built, chilling in its precision. Every transaction documented, every stream of money traced, each fragment locking into place to form an irrefutable picture. At the defense table, Ronald no longer wore expensive suits or a confident smile. He had grown thinner, gray at the temples, his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of himself. His attorneys tried everything, first claiming he had been manipulated, but forensic evidence showed every fraudulent document bore his signature. They pivoted to arguing he didn't understand what he was signing, only for Ronald's own emails to dismantle that claim. Boastful lines about moving money where it needed to go, celebratory messages about successful transfers, plans for the future with Tiffany funded by money stolen from my grandfather's business. Finally, in desperation, they blamed Tiffany, alleging she threatened and coerced him into committing the crimes. Watching that was painful, not because I still cared for Ronald, but because I saw a man who had once been my husband willing to disown his love to save himself. Nothing saved him. The signatures, emails, bank records, everything pointed to one person, Ronald Thompson, the sole owner of Thompson Home Kitchen, the man who had systematized theft from his own company. In the end, rather than gamble before a jury everyone knew he would lose, Ronald accepted a plea deal, 5 years in federal prison, full restitution totaling $349,000 once hidden accounts were uncovered and liquidated, and the permanent forfeiture of any claim to Thompson Home Kitchen or any Carter family assets. A criminal record would follow him for life, effectively ending any return to the American corporate world and the carefully polished image he once cultivated. On sentencing day, I was there. Ronald never looked at me, not even as Federal Judge Brennan read the sentence, restitution and forfeitures. He stared straight ahead, his face empty. When deputies led him away, I realized the most frightening thing. I felt nothing. No triumph, no sadness, no satisfaction. Just a cold emptiness. Exactly where love had once lived. Perhaps that was the saddest part. A week after the trial, I received a letter, a handwritten envelope with no return address, ECC, marked Augusta, Georgia. Tiffany wrote that she hadn't known Ronald was married. He had told her he was single and that she was his future. When the truth came out, she was crushed, not only by the deception, but by realizing she had unknowingly become part of a family's destruction. She made it clear she wasn't asking for forgiveness, only to apologize to me and the children. Ronald had used us both in different ways. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. I wasn't angry with Tiffany. She was a victim too. Perhaps one day I would reply, but not now. The wound was still too fresh. Restitution money came from asset seizures. The house Ronald took in the divorce, the car, the investment accounts, all auctioned and liquidated, returning $349,000 to Thompson Home Kitchen's accounts. But money was only part of it. The restaurant had been badly shaken. Suppliers were anxious. A few longtime employees considered leaving, and the neighborhood watched quietly as if waiting for an ending. I called an all-staff meeting one August afternoon. 17 people sat before me. Keisha Mitchell, our head chef of 19 years, Marcus Webb, the manager who knew the restaurant like his own breath, Carmen Rodriguez, our lead server who remembered every regular's favorite dish. I apologized for not being able to speak sooner, for not being able to let Ronald know what I knew. Then I spoke plainly. Thompson Home Kitchen had been hurt, but it was alive, and we would rebuild it together, not just as my grandfather's legacy, but as our restaurant. I announced a profit-sharing program, employee equity options, and financial training for the entire team, with one determination: none of us would ever be manipulated like that again. Keisha broke down in tears, saying we had stayed because this wasn't just a job, it was family. For the first time in months, I felt hope. The story spread through Fair-Minded Press. The Cleveland Plain Dealer and Scene magazine wrote about Thompson Home Kitchen's return. The community responded powerfully. Regulars came back and brought friends. New customers arrived to support a woman who stood up with intelligence and strategy. Food critics visited. Catering orders from churches and organizations increased. Within 6 months, the restaurant was profitable again. Within a year, I had saved enough to open a second location in Ohio City. My grandfather's legacy didn't just survive. It grew in ways he never imagined. But the hardest part wasn't business. It was healing the children. Jasmine, 13, hurt the most. While folding laundry, she asked, "Why did Dad do this? Weren't we enough? Wasn't Mom enough?" I knelt and told the truth. This had nothing to do with being enough. Some people were never taught that love matters more than money, and I would teach her the opposite. Jasmine asked again, "Do you still love Dad?" I answered, "I love the man I thought he was." But that man turned out not to exist, and I can't love someone who isn't real. Marcus, 9, didn't ask much. He just needed to know I wouldn't disappear. Every night he asked, "You'll be here when I wake up, right?" I always replied, "Always, my love, always." We began family therapy with Dr. Amara Johnson, a gentle Black woman who specializes in helping children process betrayal and trauma. Some sessions had Jasmine sobbing, Marcus angrily throwing toys, and me sitting there witnessing pain I couldn't fix. But slowly we began to heal. Dr. Johnson told me, "Resilience doesn't mean you weren't affected. It means you carry the trauma without letting it define you. Your children are learning that from you." 1 year after the trial, Thompson Home Kitchen hosted a celebration, not of founding, but of survival. The restaurant was packed. My family was there. Ruth, my mother, Uncle Frederick, cousins. Marcia came with her husband, Denise Parker, Leonard Hughes, the detectives, Elijah Carter. Everyone was there. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly, and spoke about the day I signed papers giving everything away, about how people thought I had surrendered. And I repeated my grandfather's words. Strength isn't in being the loudest. It's in knowing when to be silent, to observe, and to let arrogance destroy itself. I raised a glass to my grandfather, to truth, and to those who understand that sometimes victory comes through patience and justice. The room erupted in applause. Jasmine and Marcus hugged me tight. Ruth stood, tears falling, and amid the laughter, the clinking glasses, and the warmth of people who didn't abandon one another, I felt peace. My name is Valerie Thompson. This is my story. If you are in a storm, please remember, you haven't lost unless you choose to quit. Hold on to honesty, patience, and strategic thinking. You will find your way out. There are things that cannot be stolen. Character, integrity, the love of your children, the respect of your community, and the legacy of those who came before you. Cleveland taught me how to live through winter. My grandfather taught me that patience is a weapon. And Ronald taught me one final lesson. True strength is knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. My name is Valerie Thompson, and I'm only just beginning. If you want to hear more stories like this, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every subscription is a way for stories of justice and healing to travel farther, to the people who need them most.